My name is Audrey Rowan. I am 29 years old. At exactly 7:30 on a Friday night, I sat at table 4 of the Rainier Club in Seattle and listened to my mother tell our entire extended family that my life was a waste. The dinner was for my cousin's engagement. Crystal glasses, heavy mahogany, the kind of room my parents lived for. My mother, Cynthia, stood up to give a toast. But my mother never gave toasts. She delivered status reports. She pointed to my older brother Preston and told the room about his latest venture capital seed round. She pointed to my sister Vanessa and bragged about her lifestyle brand expanding to Aspen. Then her eyes found me. The smile on her face tightened into something that looked like pity. She let out a soft, practiced sigh. And our youngest, she said, her voice dropping so the whole room had to lean in to hear. Audrey is still finding her way. We are just glad she can pay her rent. 40 people stared at me. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and business partners. 40 witnesses to my mother erasing my dignity for sport. Welcome back to Orange Vengeance, where quiet people finally get loud, and the truth always clears the room. If you know what it feels like to be the family disappointment, drop your age in the comments and hit subscribe. Now let me take you back to that table because my mother had no idea who was watching us. I did not cry. I did not argue. I looked down at my lap and carefully aligned the edge of my linen napkin with the seam of the wooden table. I folded the fabric until it was a perfect flush square. In my family, peace was a transaction and the currency was my silence. Preston leaned over from 2 chairs down. He tapped his champagne flute against his water glass. "Do not look so miserable, Audrey," he whispered. "Mom is just being honest. Not everyone is built for the C-suite. You type in a cubicle. It is fine. I am a data scientist. I build predictive machine learning models that process millions of data points a second." But to Preston, who bundled other people's ideas into pitch decks and skimmed the management fees, I was just the family footstool. I let him believe it. If my family understood the architecture I was actually building, they would try to control it. My father laughed at something a wealthy uncle said, slapping the table. The conversation moved on, leaving me buried. I reached for my water glass, my hand steady. As I took a sip, I caught a reflection in the mirrored pillar near the center of the room. Sitting at the host table, removed from my parents' orbit of desperation, was Elias Thorne. He did not belong in a room dripping with old money pretense. While the men around him wore tailored tuxedos, Elias wore a faded gray fleece over a blue button-down. He was a pioneer of the early Seattle tech boom. He was a billionaire, and for 30 years he had been my late grandfather's business partner. My parents had not noticed him. They were too busy scanning the room for people with recognizable jewelry. But Elias was not looking at my mother. He was not looking at Preston. His sharp, dark eyes were fixed directly on me. It was not a look of pity. It was the steady, calculating gaze of a man reading a clean line of code. He raised his water glass, lifting it just an inch off the tablecloth in a microscopic salute. My chest tightened. My family thought I was a failure, but the man who helped invent modern data architecture was watching me with clear recognition. I dropped my hand to my lap and pressed my fingers against my leather purse. Inside, resting at the very bottom, was a worn notebook filled with my grandfather's handwritten equations. Equations that Elias Thorne and I were about to use to finalize a buyout. And my family was about to find out the hard way. I lowered my gaze from Elias Thorne and let my eyes drift back to my immediate surroundings. The contrast between the man at the host table and the man sitting 2 chairs away from me was a perfect summary of my entire existence. Preston raised his arm to signal a passing waiter, his French cuff pulling back just enough to reveal a heavy gold Rolex. The watch caught the ambient light of the chandelier, flashing a bright, desperate signal across the dining room. It was a timepiece designed to announce its own price tag before its owner even spoke. Across the room, Elias remained comfortably seated in his faded gray fleece, the collar slightly frayed, worn over a plain blue button-down shirt. That was the fundamental divide between my family and the reality of the city we lived in. Washington is known as the Evergreen State, a place where the landscape is defined by deep forests and relentless rain, and the culture is defined by a distinct brand of stoicism. It is a hub of global innovation, the birthplace of companies that dictate the rhythm of modern human life. But in Seattle, true power whispers. The local social fabric respects concrete achievements and quiet intellectual brilliance over loud declarations of wealth. It is an ecosystem where billionaires wear scuffed sneakers to grocery stores, and the most dangerous person in a boardroom often looks like someone who just finished a hiking trail in the Cascades. My parents never understood this quiet power. David and Cynthia Rowan spent their entire lives chasing an outdated, imported version of prestige. They worshipped country clubs, valet parking, and embossed invitations. They wanted to live in a world of velvet ropes and exclusive titles, completely blind to the fact that the actual rulers of their city were writing code in neighborhood coffee shops. They treated status as a performance, a daily stage play where every car, every vacation, and every watch was a prop meant to convince the audience that the Rowan family belonged in the upper echelons of society. Preston was their masterpiece. He possessed a staggering lack of technical skill, yet he thrived on the superficial edges of the tech industry. He called himself a venture capitalist and a serial entrepreneur. In reality, he spent his days hunting down naive angel investors to fund hollow applications that solved no actual problems. His current project was a lifestyle optimization platform that aggregated calendar events. It was a glorified digital planner, but Preston pitched it using a dizzying array of empty corporate jargon. He talked about synergizing user acquisition, leveraging blockchain dynamics, and disrupting the digital wellness space. He produced nothing of value, but he looked fantastic doing it. He wore tailored suits, drove a leased luxury sedan, and spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told he was wrong. My parents looked at him and saw the future. I was the opposite. I embodied the true ethos of the Pacific Northwest, though my family interpreted my nature as a character flaw. I am quiet, analytical, and deeply competent. As a data scientist, I do not rely on buzzwords. I build complex predictive machine learning models. My algorithms analyze historical shipping data, weather patterns, and global supply chain bottlenecks to predict structural failures before a cargo vessel even leaves a port in Asia. My code saves international logistics firms tens of millions of dollars every quarter. It is grueling, highly complex, and invisible work. Because my job does not come with a corner office or a magazine cover, my family assumes it is trivial. My mother genuinely believes my career involves fixing jammed printers and resetting passwords. To her, I am simply typing in a cubicle occupying space until I find a suitable husband to validate my existence. The dinner service continued, the clatter of silverware echoing against the mahogany walls. The cousin sitting to my left, a mild-mannered physical therapist named Ethan, turned toward me with a polite smile. He had spent the last 20 minutes listening to Vanessa describe the grueling process of selecting the correct shade of beige for her wellness brand packaging. Ethan looked exhausted. He shifted his chair slightly toward mine, seeking a refuge from the aggressive self-promotion happening on the other side of the table. "So Audrey," Ethan asked, keeping his voice low, "I read an article recently about artificial intelligence being used to predict traffic patterns in urban grids. Is that similar to the kind of data work you do?" I looked up, genuinely surprised. It was the first time anyone at a family gathering had ever asked me a direct question about my profession. I opened my mouth to explain the fundamental differences between supervised learning models and real-time data scraping, feeling a rare spark of enthusiasm. Before I could form the first syllable, Preston leaned forward, physically invading the space between Ethan and me. He let out a loud, patronizing chuckle, waving his hand in the air as if swatting away a minor annoyance. "Do not bother asking her about that stuff, Ethan," Preston interrupted, his voice carrying over the music playing in the background. "Audrey just runs spreadsheets for middle management. She does not deal with the visionary side of the industry. If you want to talk about scalable tech integration, we should discuss the seed round I just closed. We are looking at a 10 times valuation by the fourth quarter." Ethan blinked, taken aback by the sudden interruption. He offered me a quick apologetic glance before turning his attention to Preston, trapped once again in the gravitational pull of my brother's ego. I closed my mouth. The brief spark of enthusiasm extinguished, replaced by the familiar cold detachment I used to survive these dinners. I did not correct Preston. I did not point out that his startup was currently burning through cash at an unsustainable rate, a fact I knew because I had seen his public filing data. I simply sat back in my chair and stared at the white tablecloth. Preston finished his boast to Ethan, then turned his attention back to me. He snapped his fingers, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the conversation. He pointed to his empty whiskey glass, shaking the melting ice cubes at the bottom. "Audrey, be a doll and fetch me another scotch from the bar," Preston commanded. "And tell the bartender not to drown it in water this time. The service here is painfully slow tonight." He did not ask. He instructed. He spoke to me with the exact tone one might use when addressing a subordinate hired to clean the floors. My mother, sitting directly across the table, witnessed the entire exchange. She saw her eldest son snap his fingers at her youngest daughter. Instead of correcting his behavior, she offered me a gentle, encouraging nod. "Go ahead, darling," she said smoothly. "It will give you a chance to stretch your legs. You have been sitting so quietly all evening." The air in my lungs felt heavy. The vast gap between who I actually was and the pathetic caricature my family had drawn of me stretched wide open, a gaping chasm in the middle of the Rainier Club. They needed me to be small. They required my subjugation to maintain the illusion of their own grandeur. Preston needed a servant to feel like a king, and my mother needed a failure to feel like a successful parent to her other children. I stood up. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the carpet. I picked up Preston's empty glass. I did not glare at him. I did not sigh or roll my eyes. I maintained a mask of perfect, placid obedience. As I walked away from table 4, navigating through the maze of formal gowns and tailored suits, I felt the heavy gaze of Elias Thorne tracking my movement across the room. He was watching the dynamic. He saw the finger snap. He saw the compliance. I reached the polished brass rail of the bar and placed the empty glass on the marble counter. I ordered the scotch, standing in the dim light of the lounge area. My posture remained relaxed, but my mind was running through a complex sequence of variables. My family thought my compliance was a symptom of weakness. They believed I fetched drinks and absorbed their insults because I lacked the spine to defend myself. They did not understand that my silence was a calculated choice. It was the ultimate form of camouflage. While the bartender poured the amber liquid, I pressed my hand against the side of my leather purse, feeling the solid rectangular shape hidden inside. The worn notebook contained the foundational equations for a project I had conceptualized with my grandfather years ago. For 3 years, I had quietly perfected that algorithm in the shadows, shielding it from my parents' endless greed. I picked up the fresh drink, the glass cold against my palm. I turned back toward the dining room, knowing that the humble footstool they were forcing me to be was about to pull the rug out from under their entire world. The glass of scotch was cool against my palm as I navigated the crowded floor of the Rainier Club. I moved past tables draped in white linen, weaving through clusters of people discussing summer homes and golf handicaps. With every step, the leather strap of my purse bumped a steady rhythm against my hip. Inside that bag, buried beneath a spare tube of lipstick and a ring of apartment keys, rested a worn leather notebook. Its cover was scuffed along the edges, the binding held together by a single strip of black tape. To the untrained eye, it looked like discarded garbage. To the executive board of one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world, it was the key to unlocking a future they desperately wanted to control. The notebook belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Rowan. He was the only person in our bloodline who truly understood the language of the modern world. Long before Seattle became a playground for cloud computing giants, Thomas was writing code in a drafty garage in Bellevue. He built a fortune during the dot-com boom, but you would never know it by looking at him. While my parents leveraged his success to buy their way into country clubs and secure mortgages on houses with far too many columns, Thomas drove a 10-year-old Subaru Outback. He wore flannel shirts year-round and preferred the smell of pine trees over the scent of expensive cologne. He was a man of quiet substance, a pioneer who valued function over form. And he was the only person in my family who ever looked at me and saw someone worth talking to. When I was a teenager, while my parents were busy grooming Preston for a life of performative corporate leadership, I spent my weekends at my grandfather's house. We sat at his scarred wooden dining table, drinking cheap drip coffee, filling pages with algorithms and structural equations. We did not discuss school dances or designer clothes. We talked about data flows, predictive modeling, and the raw beauty of turning chaos into measurable patterns. He recognized my analytical mind long before I had the vocabulary to defend it. Shortly before his heart failed, we began sketching out a theoretical pipeline. It was a conceptual framework designed to optimize global logistics routing by analyzing weather disruptions, port congestion, and supply chain bottlenecks in real time. We mapped the foundational architecture into that leather notebook, passing the pen back and forth until the pages were covered in our cramped handwriting. He treated me as a peer, ignoring my age and focusing entirely on the logic I brought to the table. When the lawyers read my grandfather's will, my parents were enraged to discover he had left the bulk of his estate to charitable foundations. They spent months consulting attorneys trying to find a loophole to contest his final wishes. They wanted the liquid assets, the stock portfolios, the real estate. They paid no attention to the cardboard box of personal effects he left to me, which contained the notebook, a few vintage fountain pens, and a collection of loose notes. To them, I had received the worthless scraps. To me, I had received the keys to an empire. I guarded that box with my life. Over the past 3 years, I dedicated every evening and weekend to turning our theoretical sketches into functional reality. I wrote the code in the silence of my modest apartment. I tested the models against decades of historical shipping data. I refined the predictive capabilities until the algorithm could anticipate a supply chain failure weeks before it occurred. The software I built did not just work. It performed with a level of precision that disrupted existing industry standards. I named the architecture Project Evergreen, a private tribute to the state we called home and the stoic man who taught me how to think. I was holding a royal flush. For the past 6 months, I had been in high-level negotiations with a major enterprise software firm. They recognized the disruptive potential of Project Evergreen. We were finalizing the terms of a multi-million-dollar acquisition, a deal structured to transfer my intellectual property in exchange for a sum that would dwarf my parents' entire net worth. The firm negotiating for the project was notoriously ruthless, known for swallowing smaller tech startups whole. But they had never encountered a single developer holding a fully functional market-ready algorithm with zero outside investors. I dictated the terms. I set the valuation. Every legal maneuver was executed through my retained counsel, ensuring my family remained entirely disconnected from the transaction. I navigated these legal waters entirely alone, utilizing encrypted emails and strict non-disclosure agreements to keep my identity shielded from the broader market. More importantly, I kept the entire process hidden from my own blood relatives. My silence was not born of timidity. It was a rigorous, tactical defense. I knew exactly what would happen if David and Cynthia Rowan discovered I was sitting on a gold mine. They would not celebrate my brilliance. They would view my asset as community property. They would descend upon my project demanding I surrender control. They would use every psychological tool at their disposal to force me into handing the acquisition over to Preston, insisting that he possessed the business acumen to manage the capital properly. They would strip my name from the achievement and rebrand it as a victory for the Rowan family legacy. By playing the role of the invisible disappointment, I constructed an impenetrable firewall around my life's work. They could not steal what they did not know existed. I reached table 4 and placed the glass of scotch next to Preston's plate. The ice clinked against the crystal, drawing his attention. He did not say thank you. He simply picked up the drink, inspected the amber liquid, and took a sip, his eyes already wandering across the room in search of a more important conversation. My mother adjusted her posture, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her sapphire dress. She looked up at me as I pulled my chair back and sat down. "You took your time, Audrey," she murmured, her tone laced with that familiar, stinging patience. "Next time, try not to dawdle. It reflects poorly on us when you wander aimlessly." I did not let my expression change. I slipped my hand under the table and let my fingertips brush the side of my leather purse. I felt the solid rectangular outline of my grandfather's notebook resting inside. The texture of the worn leather anchored me to reality. Let them have their country club dinners and their hollow boasts. Let them view me as a failure. I was the architect of my own future, and the ink was nearly dry on my independence. The waiters began clearing the salad plates, the clatter of porcelain signaling the transition to the main course. I took a breath, ready to endure the rest of the evening in my protective silence. But the fragile piece of table 4 was about to break. Preston set his glass down harder than necessary. He pulled out his phone, stared at the screen, and cursed under his breath. The arrogant veneer he wore all night flickered, revealing something desperate beneath the surface. His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing as he read a message that clearly delivered bad news. He slid the phone into his jacket pocket, his movements sharp and erratic. He leaned across the table, dismissing the polite conversation around him, and fixed his gaze directly on me. The performance of the wealthy entrepreneur was over, and the demands were about to begin. The dessert course arrived on silver trays just as Preston shoved his chair back from the table. The sudden movement rattled the silverware, drawing brief glances from the neighboring guests. He did not offer an excuse to the table. He simply looked down at me, his jaw set in a rigid line, and tilted his head toward the arched doorway leading out of the main dining room. "We need to talk," he muttered, his voice pitched low enough to evade the ears of our extended family. "Walk with me." I did not move immediately. I placed my cloth napkin next to my dessert plate, maintaining the deliberate pacing I had practiced for years. When I stood, I noticed my mother sliding out of her chair as well. The sapphire fabric of her dress glided silently as she followed us. This was not a spontaneous sibling conversation. This was a coordinated maneuver. I followed Preston out of the dining room, the ambient noise of clinking glasses and polite laughter fading behind us. We entered an adjoining private lounge, a quiet sanctuary paneled in dark oak and lined with glass front bookshelves. The air smelled of old paper and leather polish. It was the kind of room designed for discreet negotiations and quiet alliances. Preston dropped onto a Chesterfield sofa, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. My mother stood near the door, positioning herself like a sentinel, ensuring no one interrupted the ambush. I chose a wingback chair opposite Preston, keeping my posture upright, my purse resting securely on my lap. My brother reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He withdrew a folded piece of paper, smoothing it flat against the surface of the low mahogany coffee table separating us. He retrieved a silver pen from another pocket and clicked it open. Things are moving fast with the new platform. Preston began adopting the false, overly familiar tone he used when pitching an angel investor. "We are scaling our user base, expanding our server capacity. Growth requires fuel, Audrey. You know how the startup ecosystem operates." He tapped the tip of his silver pen against the unfolded paper. Tap, tap, tap. The metallic clicking echoed sharply in the quiet room. I looked down at the document. It was a printed spreadsheet. The columns were neatly formatted, detailing a list of financial assets, routing numbers, and current balances. My eyes scanned the rows, recognizing the data instantly. It was a comprehensive inventory of my personal finances, checking accounts, modest retirement contributions, and at the very bottom a specific trust fund containing exactly $50,000. That trust was a final gift from my grandfather. Thomas had established it years ago, designating it for my personal education or future endeavors. It was a modest sum by tech industry standards, but it represented a profound gesture of faith from the only man who had ever believed in my potential. A cold realization settled over me. The statements for that specific trust were still being mailed to my parents' address in Mercer Island, a bureaucratic oversight I had neglected to update after my last apartment move. "You opened my mail," I stated. My voice remained flat, devoid of the outrage they were likely expecting. My mother shifted her weight by the door, crossing her arms defensively. Do not be dramatic, Audrey. An envelope arrived from the bank looking urgent. We were concerned about your fiscal well-being. We are a family. There are no secrets between us. Preston ignored her justification and pressed the silver pen harder against the paper circling the $50,000 balance. I am in the middle of a vital bridge round, he said, abandoning the visionary jargon for something more desperate. I have payroll to meet by Thursday. My primary investor delayed his wire transfer and I need temporary liquidity to keep the doors open until the next quarter. He slid the spreadsheet across the polished wood until it touched the edge of my chair. You are going to liquidate this trust and wire the funds to my holding company by Tuesday morning, Preston dictated. Consider it an equity buy-in. I will even draw up the paperwork giving you a fraction of a percent in shares. It is a favor, really. You are sitting on dead capital while I am building a legacy. He did not ask for a loan. He issued a directive. He spoke with the staggering entitlement of a man who viewed the people around him as natural resources meant to be harvested for his own benefit. You do not need this money anyway, Preston added, leaning back into the sofa. You live in a rent-controlled box. You take the bus. Your career is stagnant. This capital is wasted, sitting in a low-yield index fund when it could be fueling a disruptive enterprise. I looked at the silver pen resting on the table. I looked at the spreadsheet detailing the quiet, frugal life I maintained to protect my true assets. Then I looked my brother in the eyes. No, I said. The word was quiet, simple, and final. Preston blinked, his confident facade slipping for a fraction of a second. Excuse me, I am not liquidating my trust, I replied, keeping my hands folded, resting on my purse. I am not wiring you a single dollar. The temperature in the lounge seemed to drop. My mother stepped away from the door, her sapphire dress shimmering as she moved into my line of sight. The polite, sympathetic mother she played in the dining room vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating enforcer. You are being incredibly selfish, Cynthia hissed, her voice trembling with manufactured disappointment. Your brother is on the verge of a breakthrough. He is carrying the reputation of this family on his shoulders. We have all made sacrifices to ensure his success. Family solidarity means stepping up when you are called upon. I watched her perform. I observed the subtle tightening of her jaw, the specific angle of her chin meant to convey maternal authority. She was deploying guilt, the weapon she had used to keep me in line for 2 decades. What exactly are you saving this money for? My mother demanded, pointing a manicured finger at the spreadsheet. You have no ambition. You have no partner. You contribute nothing to the family legacy. The least you can do is support the child who is actually trying to make something of himself. You should be grateful we are even offering you a chance to be part of his company. I let her words hang in the air. I refused to absorb the insult. My clinical training dictated that when faced with hostile data, one must strip away the emotion and analyze the underlying mechanics. I turned my attention back to Preston. Your customer acquisition cost is $42, I stated, maintaining an even conversational tone. Your lifetime user value is currently projected at $11 based on your retention metrics. Your monthly burn rate exceeds your revenue by a factor of 8. Preston froze. The color drained from his face. How do you know my internal metrics? You filed a public prospectus during your initial seed round. I explained, my voice echoing the sterile environment of a laboratory. I read the disclosures. You are not building a disruptive enterprise, Preston. You are running a deficit engine. You are burning investor capital to lease a downtown office and project an image of success, while your actual user engagement flatlines. My mother opened her mouth to interrupt, but I did not stop speaking. Throwing $50,000 into a furnace will not change the thermodynamics of your failure. I continued, laying the facts out like surgical instruments. You do not have a cash flow problem. You have a structural deficit. My grandfather's money will not save your app. It will only delay your bankruptcy by approximately 3 weeks. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I had breached the unwritten rule of the Rowan family. I had spoken the truth out loud. Preston's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles turning white against the dark fabric of his trousers. The charming, arrogant entrepreneur evaporated, leaving behind a panicked man staring at the wreckage of his own ego. He realized in that moment that the sister he treated like a footstool possessed the analytical capacity to dismantle his entire worldview in under 60 seconds. "You arrogant little clerk!" Preston snarled, leaning across the coffee table, his voice vibrating with raw hostility. "You think typing numbers into a database makes you a genius? You know nothing about business. You know nothing about scale." My mother stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on his shoulder while glaring at me with unvarnished contempt. "You will sign the release forms on Monday," Cynthia commanded, dropping any pretense of persuasion. "We are done coddling your stubbornness. You owe this family Audrey, and we will collect what is owed." The heavy wooden door of the lounge suddenly clicked open, the brass handle turning with a deliberate, unhurried motion. The ambient noise of the dining room spilled briefly into our tense sanctuary before the door clicked shut again. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes fixed on my mother, watching the blood drain from her face as she looked past my shoulder. Her hostile expression dissolved instantly, replaced by a wide, terrified smile. Preston scrambled to his feet, nearly knocking his knees against the coffee table, his anger vanishing into a posture of desperate deference. The shadow of a man fell across the printed spreadsheet resting on the mahogany table, and a familiar voice spoke from directly behind my chair. I did not turn around immediately. I watched my mother instead. The rigid hostility in her posture dissolved in a fraction of a second. Her shoulders dropped, her eyes widened in alarm. Preston scrambled backward, his knees bumping the edge of the mahogany coffee table. He stood up so fast he nearly lost his balance. The polished veneer of the demanding entrepreneur vanished, leaving behind a man who looked like a child caught stealing from a cash register. The voice behind me was calm and resonant. "I hope I am not intruding," Elias Thorne said. He stepped into my peripheral vision, moving with the unhurried grace of a man who owned every room he entered. He did not look at my mother. He did not look at my brother. He walked past my wingback chair and stopped near the center of the seating area. Elias glanced down. The printed spreadsheet listing my personal assets and my grandfather's trust fund still rested on the table. The silver pen lay beside it. My mother held her breath. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. In their circles, leaving someone's private financial data exposed on a table was a vulgar display. For a man like Elias, whose empire was built on data security and corporate discretion, it was a glaring red flag of poor character. Elias reached down and picked up the spreadsheet. He did not study the numbers. He merely noted the formatting, the highlighted $50,000 balance, and the dark ink circle Preston had drawn around it. Without a single word, Elias turned his wrist and let the paper fall face down into the leather wastebasket positioned next to the sofa. The sound of the thick paper hitting the bottom of the bin was the loudest noise in the lounge. Preston recovered his voice. He vibrated with sudden, desperate ambition. This was the man he had spent years trying to corner at exclusive networking events. This was the legendary venture capital whale who could fund his entire company with spare change. Preston lunged forward, extending a hand that was shaking slightly. "Mr. Thorne," Preston said, his voice pitched an octave higher than usual. "Preston Rowan, it is an extraordinary honor to meet you. My father David is a long-time admirer of your holding company." Elias looked at Preston's extended hand. He let it hang in the empty space between them for 3 agonizing seconds. Then he offered a brief, obligatory handshake. The physical contact was clinical and dismissive. Preston did not take the hint. He launched into his pitch, shifting into a sycophantic frenzy. "I am the founder of a new platform in the digital wellness space." Preston continued, speaking far too quickly. "We are aggregating user lifestyle metrics to optimize daily scheduling. It is a paradigm shift in calendar integration. We are currently closing a bridge round, and the synergy between our user acquisition strategy and your recent investments in consumer tech is remarkably aligned." Preston stood there in his expensive suit and his flashing gold watch, throwing empty buzzwords at a man who had written the foundational code for modern cloud architecture. Elias ignored the pitch. He did not nod. He did not offer a polite smile. He watched Preston with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a loud, harmless insect. The silence stretched. Preston ran out of words, his mouth closing as the realization dawned that his jargon had no currency here. Elias turned his back on my brother. He looked directly at me. "Audrey," Elias said. Hearing my name spoken with such clear, unvarnished respect shifted the gravity in the room. My mother stared at Elias, her mouth slightly open, unable to comprehend why the billionaire was addressing her youngest daughter. "I was reviewing a theoretical problem earlier today." Elias continued, his tone shifting into the precise rhythmic cadence of a technical review. "When deploying a dynamic weighting algorithm across a decentralized logistics network, how do you prevent latency in the predictive node architecture from cascading into false routing anomalies?" My heart skipped a single beat. My face remained an impassive mask. He was not making small talk. He was delivering a test. Predictive node architecture was the exact framework of Project Evergreen. It was the digital spine of the algorithm I had built from my grandfather's notes. Elias was verifying my identity as the sole architect. He needed to know if I truly understood the math or if I had simply inherited a functional piece of software. Preston looked back and forth between us, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. My mother blinked rapidly, staring at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a stranger. They mocked my career. They thought I typed in a cubicle. They had no idea what those words meant. I knew exactly what they meant. "You do not rely on a centralized validation loop," I answered, keeping my voice level and authoritative. "You isolate the anomaly detection within the localized nodes using a temporal decay function. If a remote node flags a delay, the data decays based on geographical relevance before it reaches the core model. The routing adjusts in real time without triggering a system-wide cascade." I used the precise technical terminology my family despised. I did not shrink. I did not apologize for my competence. I delivered the solution with the cold precision of a structural engineer pointing out a load-bearing wall. Elias Thorne smiled. It was not a polite social gesture. It was a genuine expression of pure respect. The wrinkles around his dark eyes deepened. He nodded slowly, digesting the logic of my answer. "A temporal decay function," Elias repeated softly, almost to himself. "Elegant. It keeps the core clean and prevents the latency from corrupting the primary data stream. Your grandfather always said you had a gift for isolating the variable." The mention of my grandfather caused my mother to flinch. She stepped forward, trying desperately to insert herself into a conversation she could not grasp. "Thomas was always so fond of Audrey," Cynthia offered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "They spent hours playing on the computer together when she was younger. We are so proud she found a little data entry job to keep her busy." Elias did not acknowledge my mother. He did not look in her direction. Her attempt to minimize my work and assert her own relevance failed. Elias kept his focus on me, recognizing me as the only person in the room worthy of his time. "I am looking forward to our meeting on Tuesday," Audrey, Elias said. "We have a significant amount of ground to cover." "Tuesday at 10, I confirmed. "I will have the final architectural schematics prepared for your legal team." "Excellent," Elias replied. He offered me a brief nod, turned, and walked out of the lounge. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, leaving a suffocating vacuum in his wake. The silence in the room was profound. Preston stood frozen by the coffee table. His hands hung loosely at his sides. His face was pale and slick with a thin sheen of sweat. He had just pitched his life's work to a tech legend, only to watch that legend ignore him and schedule a private meeting with the sister he treated like a footstool. My mother stared at the closed door. Her mind was misfiring, struggling to reconcile the reality she had just witnessed with the delusion she had maintained for 29 years. Why was Elias Thorne asking her failure of a daughter about algorithms? Why did they have a scheduled meeting involving legal teams? "What was that?" Preston stammered, his voice hoarse. "What meeting? How do you know Elias Thorne?" I did not answer him. The dynamic had shifted, and I no longer owed them an explanation. I stood up from the wingback chair. I picked up my purse, ensuring the leather notebook was secure inside. I looked at the empty wastebasket where Preston's spreadsheet now rested, a discarded relic of their failed extortion attempt. "I am going back to the dining room," I said calmly. "My water glass is empty." I walked toward the door, leaving them standing in the center of the lounge. They were bewildered, disoriented, and stripped of their assumed superiority. But as I grabbed the brass handle, I knew the peace would not last. My family did not handle confusion well. They handled it with escalation. They were desperate for capital, and desperate people do not walk away from a target. They would regroup. They would manufacture a new crisis, and the next confrontation would not take place in a quiet lounge. 2 days after the engagement dinner, my phone screen illuminated with a calendar invitation. It was not a text message or a phone call, but a formal digital summons from my father for Sunday lunch at the Bellevue Country Club. In my family, an invitation to the club was never a casual request. It was a tactical deployment. You did not get summoned to the private dining room unless my parents required a captive audience or a controlled environment to extract compliance. I knew it was a trap. I accepted the invitation anyway. In any data model, avoiding an anomaly only delays the inevitable system failure. You have to observe the hostile inputs to understand how the architecture will collapse. I drove my practical sedan across the floating bridge to the east side of Lake Washington. Bellevue was a polished, pristine city that catered to the newly wealthy and the perpetually striving. The country club sat on a manicured hill, a sprawling estate designed to mimic East Coast aristocracy. It featured towering white columns, valet parking filled with imported sports cars, and an atmosphere thick with performative exclusivity. I handed my keys to a valet who looked entirely unimpressed by my vehicle, straightened my simple wool coat, and walked through the heavy glass doors. The dining room was a study in intimidation. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers catching the midday sun, and dark mahogany tables spaced far apart to ensure private conversations remained private. The maitre d' guided me to a secluded alcove near the back windows. My family was already seated. They were not reviewing menus. They sat shoulder to shoulder on the far side of a long, polished mahogany table, positioned like a tribunal, waiting for the accused to arrive. My father sat in the center wearing a sharp navy blazer. My mother sat to his right, draped in an immaculate beige cardigan, her posture rigid. Preston sat on the end, his leg bouncing with a nervous, erratic rhythm that sent tiny tremors through the floorboards. To my father's left sat Vanessa. My sister rarely attended these ambushes unless a united front was strictly required. Vanessa managed a luxury lifestyle brand that sold overpriced wellness supplements and woven baskets. Her entire existence was curated for digital consumption. She lived in a world of filtered photographs and weaponized therapy terminology. Today she wore a pristine white cashmere sweater projecting an aura of deep, empathetic concern. I took my seat on the opposite side of the mahogany table, facing the four of them alone. I did not take off my coat. I placed my purse on the empty chair beside me, keeping the leather notebook containing Project Evergreen close. No one offered a greeting. My father leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He clasped his hands together, adopting the authoritative tone he used during his corporate board meetings. "We need to address the situation regarding your brother," David announced. "The market conditions have shifted unexpectedly. Preston is facing a liquidity crunch. A group of short-sighted initial investors are threatening frivolous legal action because they lack the vision to understand his long-term growth strategy." I watched my father spin the narrative. He was using sanitized business terminology to mask the reality of his son's failure. Preston was not facing a liquidity crunch. He had burned through his capital, and his investors were likely preparing to sue him for breach of fiduciary duty. "It is a temporary reallocation of family assets." My father continued, his voice steady, ignoring the fact that he was asking me to finance a sinking ship. "We are pooling our resources to build a bridge fund. It will protect the Rowan name from unwarranted public scrutiny and allow Preston to finalize his next round of institutional funding." My mother took over seamlessly. She reached into her designer tote bag resting on the floor. She produced a thick manila folder. She placed her palm flat against the paper and pushed it across the polished mahogany table. The friction created a soft, continuous scraping sound that cut through the low hum of the dining room. The folder came to a halt exactly 2 inches from the edge of my placemat. "We had our legal counsel draft these this morning," Cynthia said, her tone brisk and commanding. "It is a limited power of attorney and a wire transfer authorization. It grants Preston the legal authority to liquidate the trust your grandfather left you and route the funds directly into his corporate holding account." She reached into her purse again, retrieved a heavy silver pen, and placed it deliberately on top of the manila folder. "We expect you to sign it today," my mother stated. "The bank requires 24 hours to clear the transfer, and Preston needs the capital secured by close of business tomorrow." I looked at the folder. I did not reach for it. I did not touch the silver pen. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the cool fabric of my coat. When I did not immediately reach for the pen, the atmosphere in the alcove shifted. The authoritative commands gave way to the psychological warfare they had spent 2 decades perfecting. They needed to break my resistance, and in our family, the primary tool for extraction was guilt. Vanessa leaned forward, tilting her head with a practiced look of sorrow. She spoke in a soft, soothing voice that dripped with condescension. "Audrey, we are doing this because we are worried about you," Vanessa purred. "Your behavior at the engagement dinner on Friday was highly erratic. You insulted Preston, you alienated the guests. You even made up a bizarre fantasy about software architecture to try and impress Elias Thorne. It was very difficult for us to watch you spiral like that." I kept my face perfectly neutral. Vanessa was attempting to rewrite history. She was spinning my factual dismantling of Preston's business model into a symptom of mental instability. "You have always harbored a deep-seated resentment toward this family," Vanessa continued, seamlessly deploying her wellness jargon. "You carry so much toxic jealousy because Preston and I chose paths with upward mobility, while you settled for a stagnant role. We want to bring you into the fold. We want to help you heal. By investing in Preston, you are finally taking a stake in something real. You are proving that you want to be part of this family." It was a masterful display of manipulation. She framed the theft of my inheritance as a therapeutic intervention. She offered me inclusion in the family, but the price of admission was my complete financial surrender. My mother nodded in solemn agreement. "You are isolating yourself, Audrey. If you refuse to support your brother in his hour of need, you are demonstrating a profound lack of empathy. We cannot maintain a relationship with someone who actively works against the survival of the family. They were threatening to disown me. They were holding their love ransom, demanding $50,000 for its safe return." I remained silent. I utilized my clinical training. I viewed the 4 people across from me not as my family, but as a dataset. I analyzed their physical tells. Preston's leg was bouncing so hard the ice water in his crystal glass vibrated in concentric circles. He kept glancing toward the club entrance, his eyes darting with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. My father's jaw was locked, the muscles twitching beneath his skin. My mother's knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of the mahogany table. They were projecting authority, but the underlying data revealed sheer panic. Preston was not just facing a lawsuit. He was facing total ruin, and the desperation was suffocating them. The silence stretched. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room became the only sound in our alcove. "Sign the papers." Audrey, my father ordered, his corporate facade cracking to reveal a sharp, jagged edge of panic. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Stop playing games." I did not touch the pen. I let the silence hang in the air, thick and heavy. I watched them drown in their own manufactured crisis. I was not going to yield, and the realization that their lifelong conditioning was no longer working began to curdle the air between us. The tension in the alcove reached a breaking point, a fragile pane of glass ready to shatter. I kept my eyes locked on the manila folder, waiting for the inevitable collapse, unaware that the variable which would shatter their reality was currently walking across the dining room floor. My father leaned closer across the polished mahogany, his corporate composure fracturing under the weight of my silence. He planted his palms flat on the table, his knuckles turning white. The ice in his water glass clinked against the crystal, a sharp sound that punctuated the rising hostility in the alcove. "You are crossing a line," David stated, his voice dropping to a harsh register he usually reserved for terminating employees. "If you walk out of this dining room without signing that document, you are no longer part of this family. We will cut you off. No holidays, no inheritance, no safety net of any kind. You will be entirely on your own." Cynthia nodded in grim agreement, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Vanessa looked down at her lap, playing the role of the tragic peacemaker who could do nothing to stop the inevitable destruction of her sister. They were deploying the nuclear option. For 29 years, the threat of exile had kept everyone in their designated roles. They assumed the prospect of losing their conditional affection would shatter my resolve and force me to pick up the silver pen. They did not understand that I had been emotionally isolated since childhood. Exile was not a punishment to me, it was a formal release. Before I could articulate my refusal, the heavy oak doors at the front entrance of the dining room swung open. The ambient chatter of the country club seemed to dip, recalibrating around a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. A figure stepped onto the plush carpet. It was Elias Thorne. The reaction of the country club staff was immediate and deeply revealing. Earlier, when my father had snapped his fingers to request a different table by the window, the waitstaff had responded with polite, practiced indifference. They recognized David as a man who paid his monthly dues but possessed no real influence. Now the head maitre d' darted across the floor with an urgency that bordered on panic. He did not ask Elias for a reservation. He bowed his head slightly, offering a greeting of hushed, profound reverence. He gestured toward a private VIP suite in the back, his entire posture radiating subservience to a founding member of the establishment. Elias waved the maitre d' away with a gentle, dismissing flick of his wrist. He wore a dark navy sweater over a collared shirt, bypassing the strict jacket requirement of the club, with the casual immunity granted only to industry titans. He scanned the room. His sharp eyes swept past the wealthy patrons, the local politicians, and the real estate developers, picking at their expensive salads. Then his gaze locked onto our secluded alcove. He altered his trajectory, walking directly toward our table. The measured rhythm of his footsteps felt like a ticking clock marking the end of an era. My father noticed him first. The transformation was instantaneous and stomach-turning. The aggressive, domineering patriarch who had just threatened to disown his daughter vanished into thin air. David practically vaulted out of his chair, smoothing the lapels of his blazer, his face contorting into a mask of sycophantic joy. Cynthia followed suit, her rigid hostility evaporating into a syrupy, performative smile that failed to reach her eyes. She discreetly kicked Preston under the table. Preston jolted upright. He spun around and saw the billionaire approaching. The sheer desperation in my brother eclipsed any remaining sense of dignity or social grace. He saw a financial lifeline walking across the carpet. If he could not bully his sister into surrendering $50,000 to save his sinking company, he would secure a multi-million-dollar investment directly from the source. Preston did not wait for Elias to reach the edge of our table. He lunged forward, placing his body physically between Elias and me, acting as a frantic human barrier. He extended his hand, flashing a brilliant manufactured smile designed for networking events and pitch meetings. "Mr. Thorne Preston," declared, his voice booming with forced, hollow confidence. "What an unexpected privilege. We briefly crossed paths at the Rainier Club on Friday evening. I am Preston Rowan." Elias stopped walking. He looked down at Preston's extended hand, then slowly raised his eyes to meet my brother's frantic gaze. He did not accept the handshake. He simply stood there, a mountain of quiet, immovable authority, facing a crumbling facade of desperation. Preston withdrew his hand covertly, wiping his palm against the fabric of his tailored trousers, but he did not stop talking. He could not tolerate the silence. He launched into an aggressive rapid-fire pitch, his words tumbling over each other in a rush to secure funding before the billionaire walked away. "I know your time is incredibly valuable," Preston rushed on, adopting his venture capitalist persona to mask his terror. "But I have recently restructured the equity offerings for my digital wellness platform. We are pivoting toward a decentralized data aggregation model, leveraging user and synergies to maximize retention metrics. If you have 5 minutes, I can walk you through our updated growth projections. We are positioned to dominate the holistic scheduling sector by the third quarter. Elias listened. He stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He did not nod politely. He did not blink. He gave Preston exactly 30 seconds of dead, uninterrupted silence. The contrast in the room was agonizing. Preston was vibrating with manic, sweaty energy, a salesman peddling broken promises to a man who owned the factory. Elias was a study in pure competence, observing a hollow performance with the clinical detachment of a researcher studying a failing experiment. Preston began to sweat, a single bead rolling down his temple as he stammered, trying to fill the void with more meaningless jargon. The conflict in the alcove pivoted right then. The internal family abuse, the threats of disownment, the psychological warfare orchestrated by my parents faded into the background noise. This was no longer about a toxic family trying to steal a modest trust fund from their youngest daughter. It was an external collision between genuine substance and empty pretense. It was the clash between a man who built global infrastructure and a boy who sold illusions. Elias shifted his gaze. He looked past Preston's trembling shoulder, bypassing my father's eager, deferential smile and my mother's breathless anticipation. He looked down at the polished mahogany table. He stared directly at the thick manila folder resting 2 inches from my placemat. He saw the silver pen waiting to be used. He understood exactly what kind of transaction was being forced in this secluded corner of the dining room. Finally, Elias lifted his eyes and locked them with mine. I sat quietly in my chair, my hands still folded in my lap, refusing to display any sign of the anxiety my family had tried to instill in me. We shared a moment of silent, profound communication across the table. No words were needed to explain the extortion taking place. Elias recognized the predatory nature of the people standing around me, and I recognized that the man standing in front of my brother was not a savior arriving by mere coincidence, but a peer arriving for a scheduled convergence. The trap my parents had carefully laid was about to spring shut, but they were no longer the ones holding the trigger. The glass of scotch was cool against my palm as I navigated the crowded floor of the Rainier Club earlier that week, but the memory of that compliance felt like a lifetime ago. Now sitting in the Bellevue Country Club alcove, the dynamic had shifted so violently that the air felt thin. Preston stopped talking. He stood tall, his chest puffed out, flashing a brilliant white smile honed by years of failing upward. Growing up, my brother navigated the world by relying entirely on his charm. He charmed his high school teachers into raising his grades. He charmed our parents into buying his first luxury sedan. He firmly believed that confidence was an acceptable substitute for competence. He expected Elias Thorne to nod, clap him on the shoulder, and invite him to a private golf game to discuss terms. Elias did none of those things. He let Preston's manufactured enthusiasm hang in the stagnant air of the alcove. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Preston's smile began to falter, the corners of his mouth twitching as the reality of the unyielding quiet set in. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was quiet and devoid of any social padding. What is your baseline user acquisition cost, and how does it scale against your projected lifetime value per user over an 18-month retention period? Elias asked. The question was basic. It was the fundamental metric of any consumer-facing application. Anyone managing a legitimate tech enterprise would have those numbers memorized down to the decimal point. Preston blinked. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly hue. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He shifted his weight from his left foot to his right, a subtle tell of his mounting panic. "Well, Mr. Thorne," Preston began, his voice lacking its previous booming resonance. "Our current metrics are highly dynamic. We are focusing heavily on leveraging cross-platform synergy to create a truly disruptive ecosystem. The initial acquisition cost is secondary to the brand awareness we are generating within the wellness space." He was deploying a smokescreen. He threw hollow terminology at the billionaire, hoping the shiny words would distract from the terrifying fact that he had no idea what his own business actually cost to operate. Elias did not flinch. He did not let the deflection slide. "Synergy does not pay for server space," Elias replied, his tone remaining clinical and flat. Let us move past the marketing pitch and discuss your infrastructure. You claim you are pivoting toward a decentralized data aggregation model. Explain your back-end data pipeline. How are you handling server load scaling when concurrent user sessions spike during peak morning hours? Preston swallowed hard. A visible bead of sweat formed at his temple, catching the light of the crystal chandelier above us. The moisture began to gather at the collar of his bespoke shirt. The expensive tailored cotton meant to project effortless wealth was now clinging to his neck, soaking through as his internal temperature skyrocketed. The decentralized model, Preston stammered, raising a hand to rub the back of his neck. It utilizes a highly integrated blockchain approach. We are integrating blockchain protocols to ensure that our user-end synergies remain secure while simultaneously disrupting the traditional calendar data market. Elias cut him off. The interruption was sharp, precise, and entirely devastating. I did not ask for a brochure, son, Elias stated, his voice cutting through the dining room chatter like a blade. I asked for the architecture. You are throwing words like blockchain and synergy into a sentence that requires a functional engineering response. Tell me how a simple data query travels from your user interface to your database and back. Tell me the specific latency you are experiencing and how you are mitigating it. Preston froze. He looked exactly like a student who had walked into a final exam for a class he had never attended. His lungs expanded rapidly as he searched for air. The golden child, the pillar of the Rowan family, the man who was supposed to carry our legacy into the upper echelons of society, was being dismantled in front of an audience of one. In a final desperate move, Preston turned his head and looked at our father. He sought a lifeline. David had spent decades bailing his son out of trouble, writing checks to cover failed ventures, and making phone calls to smooth over public embarrassments. But David was a man who built his career on firm handshakes and golf course negotiations. He could not write a line of code. He did not know what a data query was. My father sat paralyzed in his mahogany chair. He stared back at Preston with wide, terrified eyes, completely unable to offer any assistance. The patriarch of our family looked away, breaking eye contact with his favorite child, staring down at his empty porcelain plate. The alcove went painfully quiet. The ambient noise of the country club faded into an insignificant hum. The total incompetence of my brother was laid bare, illuminated by the unforgiving light of genuine expertise. Elias did not revel in the humiliation. He simply processed the data, concluded that Preston was an empty vessel, and dismissed him entirely. Elias turned his gaze away from the sweating, stammering man standing before him. He looked across the table and locked eyes with me. Audrey, Elias said, his voice shifting back to the tone of a colleague consulting a peer. How would you fix his pipeline? My mother let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. My father's head snapped up. They stared at me as if I had suddenly materialized from thin air. I did not hesitate. I did not look at my parents or my brother. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands folded securely in my lap, and I delivered the autopsy report on Preston's business model. I would not fix it, I answered, maintaining a calm, measured cadence. I would scrap it entirely. His foundational structure relies on a monolithic architecture that will inevitably crash under the weight of any significant user base. The user acquisition cost is exponentially higher than the projected revenue, creating an unsustainable burn rate. I continued, letting the cold facts do the work. His data bottlenecks are fatal. He is attempting to aggregate dynamic calendar events using third-party protocols that actively throttle bandwidth during peak hours. By routing every simple data query through a single unoptimized server cluster, he has created an inherent latency that guarantees a poor user experience. Furthermore, integrating a decentralized ledger system into a basic scheduling application introduces unnecessary computational friction. It is a mathematical impossibility for his current model to achieve profitability. The structural flaws are terminal. I finished speaking. The diagnosis took less than 2 minutes. I spoke in precise, unassailable facts, stripping away the polished veneer of my brother's company to reveal the rotting wood beneath. Preston collapsed into the empty chair beside Vanessa. He did not say a word. He stared blankly ahead, his shoulders hunched, his bespoke shirt damp with the physical manifestation of his utter humiliation. His incompetence had been broadcast in high definition in front of the very man he was trying to con. He was broken. My parents sat frozen, struggling to process the reality unfolding in front of them. The daughter they had conditioned to be invisible, the scapegoat they had designated to absorb their failures, had just casually dismantled their golden child, using a vocabulary they could not comprehend. The silence that followed was dense and dangerous. The balance of power had shifted permanently. My mother could not tolerate the shift. Cynthia Rowan was a woman who survived by controlling the narrative. If reality contradicted her script, she simply attempted to rewrite the scene. She forced a high-pitched, brittle laugh that echoed awkwardly in the secluded alcove. She reached out, adjusting her beige cardigan with trembling fingers. "Oh, listen to our little computer geek," Cynthia chirped, her voice dripping with artificial amusement and a desperate cloying condescension. She learns a few big technical words at her data entry job, and suddenly she thinks she can run a boardroom. Audrey always had an overactive imagination. It is charming, really, but we should let the men handle the serious business discussions. She was trying to laugh it off. She was attempting to shrink the moment to invalidate my expertise and stuff me back into the small, manageable box they had built for me. She wanted to convince Elias that my analysis was merely the rambling of a confused subordinate. She was desperately clinging to the delusion that she was still in charge of the table. I did not react to her mockery. I did not raise my voice or defend my intelligence. I simply unclasped the latch of my leather purse, allowing the heavy brass hardware to click softly against the table. I reached inside, my fingers sliding past the worn notebook that contained Project Evergreen, moving toward the documents that would finalize the destruction of their false empire. The time for listening to their insults was over. The time for providing receipts had arrived. My mother's artificial laughter faded into the quiet space of the alcove, dissipating like smoke. She realized her attempt to minimize my clinical breakdown of Preston's business had failed to elicit a response from Elias. The billionaire remained silent, offering no polite chuckle to validate her performance. Cynthia Rowan possessed a singular tactic when her social reality was threatened. She ignored the disruption and forced the original agenda. She reached across the polished mahogany, placing her manicured hand on the manila folder containing the limited power of attorney. She pushed the cardboard forward, sliding it closer to my placemat. "Elias, please excuse us for a moment," my mother said, her tone adopting a strained, formal courtesy. "We are just handling some private family matters. It is a minor financial transition to support Preston's new venture." Audrey was just about to sign the authorization. I looked at the folder resting near my water glass. It represented 2 decades of emotional conditioning. It was a physical manifestation of their belief that I existed solely to absorb their failures and fund their delusions. I placed my index finger on the edge of the cardboard. "We are not handling anything, Mom," I said. My voice was level, devoid of any anger or sorrow. The time for compliance was over. I kept my finger on their folder and gently pushed it back across the smooth wood, sliding it out of my space and returning it to the center of the table. I then reached down to the empty chair beside me. I picked up my leather portfolio, the one I used for corporate meetings. The material was supple and understated, a stark contrast to my mother's ostentatious designer tote bag. I placed the portfolio on my lap. The dining room around us seemed to hold its breath. I gripped the brass zipper. The crisp, satisfying sound of the metal teeth unzipping echoed sharply in the quiet alcove. It was the sound of a vault opening. I reached inside the dark interior of the case. I bypassed the scattered pens and the transit passes. I retrieved 2 distinct stacks of paper secured by heavy binder clips. I placed them deliberately on the table, positioning them side by side in front of me. The first stack was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The thick paper stock bore a heavy, intricate watermark visible even in the ambient light of the chandelier. The second stack was an acquisition term sheet. It detailed the transfer of intellectual property, specific financial escrow routing, and post-sale integration timelines. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at my brother. I turned my attention entirely to the man standing near the edge of our table. I shifted my posture, adopting the square direct alignment of a peer entering a boardroom negotiation. Elias, I believe we are ready to finalize the acquisition of Project Evergreen, I said. The words hung in the air, severing the invisible strings my family had used to control me. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter speaking to her parents' wealthy idol. I was a founder, initiating a close with a buyer. David and Cynthia stared at the papers, their brows furrowing in profound confusion. The vocabulary I used did not compute within the rigid framework of their worldview. My father opened his mouth, searching for a way to assert his patriarchal dominance, but the corporate terminology short-circuited his response. Acquisition, Project Evergreen, finalize. These were words they associated with boardrooms and luxury hotels, not with the child they forced to sit at the end of the table during Thanksgiving. Preston, however, possessed enough superficial knowledge of the tech industry to recognize the shape of his own ruin. He had spent years studying term sheets, desperately trying to trick someone into signing one. He leaned forward, his eyes darting toward the documents resting in front of me. His gaze caught the letterhead on the first page of the acquisition agreement. It featured the distinct minimalist logo of Elias Thorne's primary holding company. The remaining color drained from Preston's face. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords failed to produce a sound. He looked from the logo to Elias, then slowly turned his head to stare at me. The arrogant entrepreneur vanished, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who realized he had brought a paper sword to a tactical strike. "What is this?" my father demanded, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at the documents. "What are you talking about?" I kept my eyes on Elias, offering him a brief nod before turning my attention to the bewildered people sitting across from me. "You have spent years telling your friends that I type in a cubicle." I began, keeping my cadence slow and deliberate. "You told our extended family that I run spreadsheets for middle management. You assumed my quiet life was evidence of a lack of ambition. You thought I was stagnant." I rested my hands on either side of the term sheet. I was not stagnant. I explained, dismantling their fiction piece by piece. I am a data scientist. I specialize in predictive machine learning. For the past 3 years, I have been writing a proprietary algorithm. It is a highly complex logistical architecture designed to predict and mitigate supply chain bottlenecks on a global scale. The structural foundation for this model was something grandfather and I conceptualized together in his garage long before he died. My mother flinched at the mention of Thomas. She shook her head in an involuntary gesture of denial. "That is impossible," Cynthia whispered, her voice tight and defensive. "You do not have the resources to build a company. You drive a 10-year-old car. You live in a tiny apartment. I live below my means to protect my capital." I corrected her, adopting the tone of a teacher explaining basic arithmetic to a struggling student. "I funded my own server space. I maintained total ownership of my intellectual property. I deliberately presented myself as unremarkable to ensure that neither of you ever felt tempted to interfere. My invisibility was a shield against your greed." I gestured toward the billionaire standing silently at the edge of the alcove. "Elias Thorne did not walk over to this table by coincidence," I stated, bringing the full weight of the situation crashing down upon them. "He did not approach us because he recognized you, Dad. He did not come over to listen to Preston pitch a doomed calendar application. Elias is here because we had a scheduled meeting to finalize the sale of my software." My father slumped back in his mahogany chair, the leather creaking under his sudden weight. The realization was physically striking him. His youngest daughter, the one he had just threatened to disown, was conducting high-level corporate negotiations in his country club. Preston finally found his voice. It emerged as a weak, ragged whisper. He stared at the watermarked non-disclosure agreement, his mind desperately trying to calculate the math of his own failure. "You are selling your code to him?" Preston asked, his eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending panic. "For how much?" I looked at my brother. I saw the envy clawing at his throat. He had spent his entire adult life chasing the validation of men like Elias Thorne. He had leased luxury cars, bought bespoke suits, and weaponized our family's social standing to project an image of success. He had begged and borrowed to keep his illusions afloat, all while assuming I was too timid to play the game. The valuation of Project Evergreen is not a subject for family discussion, I replied, locking eyes with Preston, but I will provide you with a relevant context. I paused, allowing the silence to stretch across the table. I needed them to hear every single syllable of the next sentence. I needed them to understand that the power dynamic in the Rowan family had not just shifted, it had been permanently eradicated. The initial payout structured in this term sheet, I said calmly, dwarfs the combined net worth of this entire family. The grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room chimed a low, resonant note that seemed to echo the finality of my statement. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. My father stared at the tablecloth, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. Vanessa, who had remained perfectly silent during the entire ordeal, slowly pulled her hands away from the polished wood, shrinking back into her chair. They had orchestrated this lunch to strip me of $50,000. They had brought me here to exert their dominance and force my compliance through guilt and intimidation. They thought they were the predators circling a defenseless target. Instead, they had unwittingly seated themselves at the table to watch their scapegoat execute a transaction that elevated her beyond their reach forever. The documents resting in front of me were not just financial agreements. They were a declaration of independence signed in ink and sealed with the irrefutable proof of my quiet, enduring brilliance. I had brought facts to a room built on fiction, and the resulting collision was about to reduce their carefully curated social status to ash. The silence in the alcove deepened until it felt like a physical pressure in the room. The ambient noise of the country club faded away. My father stared at me. His mouth parted slightly, struggling to process a reality that defied every rule he had ever established. He had spent his life quantifying human worth by salary brackets and car brands. Now the daughter he deemed worthless was sitting across from him holding a contract that eclipsed his entire financial legacy. David raised his right hand, perhaps to point a finger, perhaps to issue a command he no longer had the authority to enforce. His fingers brushed the heavy silver fork resting beside his unused salad plate. His motor control faltered. The fork slipped from his trembling grip. It struck the edge of the fine china plate before clattering onto the mahogany table. The sharp metallic clatter echoed through the secluded dining space. It was the sound of a patriarch losing his crown. Elias Thorne stepped forward, closing the distance between the edge of the alcove and the table. He did not ask for permission to intrude. He simply occupied the space with the natural gravity of a man accustomed to leading industries. He reached into the inner pocket of his gray fleece and retrieved a sleek, matte black fountain pen. He bypassed Preston entirely. He bypassed my father. Elias directed his attention to the acquisition term sheet resting in front of me. "Your daughter is not merely a competent developer," Elias said, his voice carrying the calm, resonant authority of a judge reading a verdict. He looked directly at David and Cynthia, his dark eyes radiating undisguised contempt. "She is the architect of the most efficient predictive logistics model I have seen in 20 years. My mother shrank back into her chair, her beige cardigan suddenly looking like armor that had failed to protect her. Thomas and I discussed the theoretical potential of this architecture shortly before he passed. Elias continued invoking my grandfather's name like a gavel striking wood. He knew the industry needed a decentralized routing protocol, but he also knew he did not have the time to build it. He told me his granddaughter possessed the specific analytical discipline required to solve the latency equation. He was correct. Audrey built this entire ecosystem on her own. She designed the nodes. She wrote the code. She created a product that will render current global shipping software obsolete by the end of the fiscal year. Elias turned his head slowly, fixing his gaze on Preston. My brother looked like a hollow shell. The bespoke suit hung on his frame like a costume he had outgrown. The venture capitalist persona he had cultivated for a decade had been stripped away, leaving only a frightened, indebted man staring at a titan he could never hope to emulate. "And you," Elias said, addressing Preston with a tone devoid of any professional courtesy. You sat here attempting to extort $50,000 from her trust fund. You demanded she surrender her grandfather's final gift to fund a failing calendar application. You wanted to drain a genuine innovator to subsidize a digital illusion. Preston lowered his head. He could not meet the billionaire's eyes. He stared at his own trembling hands resting on his lap. The narrative our family had relied upon for decades collapsed in real time. The golden child was exposed as a liability. The invisible scapegoat was revealed as the only actual pillar in the room. Elias uncapped his fountain pen. He leaned over the mahogany table. Without a moment of hesitation, he signed his name on the final page of the acquisition term sheet. The ink flowed smoothly across the heavy paper stock. He flipped to the non-disclosure agreement and signed that as well. He placed the cap back on his pen and tapped it once against the polished wood. "The transaction is binding," Elias stated, looking at me with a nod of profound professional respect. "My legal team will initiate the escrow transfer on Monday morning. Welcome to the board, Audrey." "Thank you, Elias," I replied, my voice steady and clear. Elias stepped back from the table. He did not offer a farewell to my parents or my siblings. He simply turned and walked out of the alcove, disappearing into the crowded dining room, leaving my family stranded in the wreckage of their own making. I watched my parents. I needed to see how they would process this catastrophic shift in power. For 29 years, they had defined their self-worth by their superiority over me. Now they were sitting across from a newly minted corporate powerhouse who owed them nothing. The paralysis held them captive for a long, suffocating minute. David stared at the signed documents as if they were venomous. Vanessa remained perfectly still, her eyes darting back and forth between the term sheet and my face, calculating the new social hierarchy. But Cynthia Rowan possessed a survival instinct honed by decades of social climbing. She could not defeat the facts, so she immediately attempted to co-opt them. I watched the sickening shift occur in real time. The rigid, furious line of my mother's mouth softened. Her shoulders relaxed. She lifted her chin, her eyes brightening with a sudden artificial warmth. She leaned forward across the mahogany table, reaching out with both hands, as if she intended to pull me into an embrace. "Oh, Audrey, darling," Cynthia cooed, her voice adopting a breathless melodic pitch. "We had no idea. We are so proud of you." The sheer audacity of her pivot sent a chill down my spine. Less than 5 minutes ago, she had handed me a limited power of attorney and threatened to banish me from the family if I did not surrender my savings to Preston. Now she was looking at me as if I were her greatest achievement. "This is wonderful news for the family," my mother continued, her smile widening into a grotesque mask of maternal affection. "You kept this such a wonderful secret. It makes perfect sense now. You were so focused on your brilliance that you did not have time for regular social events. We always knew you had your grandfather's special spark. We just wanted to push you to realize your full potential." She was rewriting history while the ink on the contract was still wet. She was attempting to fold my independent triumph into the Rowan family legacy, claiming my success as a byproduct of her excellent parenting. She wanted to return to the Rainier Club and tell her wealthy friends that her youngest daughter had just closed a monumental tech acquisition. She wanted to wear my success like a new piece of jewelry. David seized the opportunity to salvage his pride. He cleared his throat, sitting up straighter in his chair. He adjusted the lapels of his navy blazer and offered a stiff, approving nod. "Your mother is right," David said, forcing a hearty tone. "This changes everything. We need to plan a celebration. We can host a dinner here at the club next weekend, introduce you to some key financial advisors who can help you manage a windfall of this magnitude. Preston can even offer some insight on diversifying your portfolio." I did not smile. I did not accept their sudden, suffocating warmth. I sat perfectly still, observing them with the detached precision of a scientist studying a parasitic organism. The realization settled over me cold and absolute. Their love was entirely conditional. It was a transactional currency withheld when I served no purpose and freely offered the moment I gained tangible leverage. They did not love me. They loved the proximity to power. They loved the reflected glow of wealth. If I had signed their predatory folder, they would have drained my accounts and continued treating me like a servant. Because I had proven myself untouchable, they were ready to crown me their favorite child. It was a horrifying display of emotional bankruptcy. I looked at my mother's outstretched hands hovering over the table, waiting for me to reach back and accept her fraudulent affection. I did not reach back. I carefully gathered the signed term sheet and the non-disclosure agreement. I aligned the edges of the thick paper stock, tapping them gently against the table to ensure a perfect square. I opened my leather portfolio and slid the documents inside. I zipped the portfolio shut, securing my future behind a brass closure. I rested my hands on top of the leather case and looked directly into my mother's expectant, desperate eyes. She thought the conflict was over. She thought the revelation of my wealth had secured her a new source of social capital. She did not realize that exposing my success was only the first phase of the operation. The true reckoning had not yet begun. I still had one more piece of paper in my possession, and I was about to show them exactly how deeply I understood their game. My mother held her hands suspended over the mahogany table. Her performative smile was frozen in place. She waited for me to accept her sudden display of maternal affection and validate her new narrative. She wanted me to welcome her into the victory she had tried to prevent. I kept my hands resting on top of my zipped portfolio. I did not move. I let her arms hover in the empty space between us until the physical discomfort forced her to lower them. Elias Thorne had not gone far. He reached the edge of the alcove and paused to retrieve his coat from the front desk concierge. The acoustics of the dining room were designed to carry sound across the vaulted ceilings. He was well within hearing distance. Several other wealthy patrons sitting at nearby tables had also stopped their conversations. They were captivated by the silent tension radiating from our table. I unzipped the front pocket of my leather portfolio. The brass teeth separated with a sharp sound that caused my father to flinch. He recognized the shift in my posture. He knew the negotiation was not over. I did not pull out another legal contract. I withdrew a single sheet of printer paper. It was a standard-sized document, printed in crisp color ink. I placed it on the table and turned it so my parents and my brother could view the contents. The paper contained a screenshot of a digital text thread. 3 months ago, I visited my parents' house on Mercer Island for a required Sunday dinner. I needed to check a work email and used the shared family tablet sitting on the kitchen counter. While the browser loaded, a notification banner appeared at the top of the screen. It was a message from Preston to a group chat titled Family Updates. The text preview contained my name and a dollar amount. I clicked the notification. I read the entire history of their conversation. As a data scientist, I understand the importance of preserving original records. I took multiple screenshots and forwarded them to my private server before deleting the evidence of my access from the device. I looked down at the printed page resting on the mahogany wood. I picked it up and held it at chest level. "You claim you are proud of me," I said, keeping my voice loud enough to carry to the edge of the alcove where Elias stood listening. "You claim you always wanted me to realize my potential. Let us examine the data to verify that hypothesis." My mother stared at the paper. The color drained from her face as she recognized the distinctive blue and gray text bubbles of their private group chat. "Date of communication is October 14th. I read aloud, my tone devoid of emotion. "Sender is Preston Rowan." The message reads as follows. "The initial investors are threatening a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty. I need liquidity by the end of the month, or they will audit the seed funds and discover the shortfall." Preston sank lower in his chair. He stared at his water glass, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Sender is Cynthia Rowan." I continued, my voice acting as a clinical instrument slicing through their pristine reputation. The message reads as follows. "What about the trust fund Thomas left for Audrey? She has 50,000 sitting in that index fund. She has no life and no ambition. She will never use it for anything important. We can reallocate it to save your company." My father closed his eyes. He rubbed his temples with his fingertips, realizing the trap they had built for me had just snapped shut on their own necks. "Sender is David Rowan." I read, delivering the final piece of evidence. The message reads as follows. "We can use her guilt Tell her it is a requirement for family solidarity. We will host a lunch at the club and put the paperwork in front of her. We have enough leverage to make her sign." I lowered the paper. I placed it gently back onto the table. I had used a bright yellow highlighter to illuminate the word leverage. The neon ink practically glowed against the white paper. Elias Thorne stood motionless at the boundary of our seating area. His face was a mask of carved stone. He absorbed the full scope of their moral bankruptcy. The surrounding club members, the very people my parents spent their entire lives trying to impress, were listening in stunned silence. The elite social circles of Bellevue and Seattle are small and highly connected. My family had just been exposed as predators in front of the people they worshipped. Preston tried to salvage his dignity. He grabbed his napkin and twisted the fabric in his sweaty hands. "You are taking those messages out of context." Preston stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "It was just business talk. We were exploring all available capital avenues. We never intended to force you. It was merely a preliminary strategy discussion." I looked at my brother. I did not raise my voice, but the weight of my words pinned him to his chair. "Do not attempt to categorize extortion as business talk," I replied. "The legal definition of financial coercion involves the use of pressure and manipulation to force an individual to surrender their assets. You mapped out a systematic plan to drain my savings. You weaponized my grandfather's death. You orchestrated the public insults at the engagement dinner to diminish my self-worth. You manufactured this country club intervention to corner me in a public setting where you assumed I would be too embarrassed to refuse." I tapped the yellow highlighted word on the paper. "This is not a strategy discussion," I stated. "This is a targeted campaign of abuse. I process data for a living. I look for patterns, variables, and predictable outcomes. Your actions form a perfect, unassailable data set of toxicity. You did not want to include me in the family fold. You wanted to consume my resources to delay your own inevitable collapse." My mother covered her face with her hands. A quiet, ragged sob escaped her throat. She was not crying out of remorse for her actions. She was crying because her carefully curated social identity was disintegrating in real time. The members of the Bellevue Country Club were witnessing her true nature. The story of her attempting to steal from her youngest daughter to fund her fraudulent son would spread through their network by sunset. Her status was permanently revoked. My father looked at the highlighted text message. He looked at Elias Thorne, who was watching them with an expression of pure disgust. David Rowan realized his legacy was ruined. He had spent his life chasing proximity to wealth and power, only to have his moral failures broadcast in front of a billionaire holding company founder. "You are trapped in a narrative of your own design," I told them, my voice echoing the stoic chill of the Pacific Northwest. "You relied on my silence to execute your plans. You assumed my quiet demeanor was a symptom of weakness. You failed to realize that silence is the optimal environment for building architecture that can withstand an attack." I left the printed screenshot resting on the mahogany table. The bright yellow ink served as a beacon of their failure. The public exposure was the ultimate consequence for their behavior. They had sacrificed their integrity for a hollow illusion of prestige, and now they were left with neither. The financial transaction with Elias Thorne had secured my future, but laying out the raw facts of their exploitation had secured my freedom. The time for being the family scapegoat had officially expired. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows of the Bellevue Country Club illuminated the dust particles dancing in the air above our table. It was a serene, luxurious environment designed to shelter the wealthy from the harsh realities of the world. Yet, in this secluded alcove, the reality was harsher than any winter storm rolling off the Pacific. My mother lowered her hands from her face. The tears streaking her makeup were genuine, but their origin was entirely self-serving. She was mourning the death of her social capital. Yet Cynthia Rowan possessed a terrifying ability to adapt. When intimidation failed and exposure left her cornered, she instinctively reached for the oldest weapon in her maternal arsenal. She deployed victimhood disguised as affection. She leaned across the mahogany surface. Her beige cardigan slipped off one shoulder as she stretched her arms toward me. Her manicured fingers reached out to grasp my hands. "We are your family." "Audrey," she pleaded, her voice trembling with a manufactured fragility. "We made mistakes. We were under so much pressure with Preston and his business. But you cannot hold this against us. A windfall like this changes everything. Family must stick together when blessings arrive. We need to heal and move forward as a united front." I observed her outstretched fingers. I did not recoil. I simply shifted my posture, pulling my hands back and folding them neatly on my lap. The empty air between us forced her to let her arms drop heavily onto the table. My gaze shifted to the manila folder containing the limited power of attorney they had tried to force upon me. It sat near the center of the table, right where I had pushed it earlier. I extended my right arm. I pressed a firm single finger onto the center of the cardboard cover. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I slid the document further away from me, pushing it across the polished wood until it came to rest directly in front of Preston. "There is no windfall for you," I stated, my voice carrying the sterile calm of a corporate legal briefing. "There is no shared blessing. My assets are currently being shielded in a blind trust managed by an independent fiduciary." I watched my mother process the terminology. A blind trust meant she could not guilt me into writing a check, because I technically no longer had direct access to the capital. It was a fortress she could not breach with tears or threats. "My legal team has received explicit instructions," I continued, outlining the perimeter of their new reality. "Any request for funding from Preston or Vanessa, or either of you, is to be immediately rejected. Furthermore, those requests will be recorded and archived as a matter of legal record. You have zero access to my finances. You have zero leverage over my future." For the first time in my 29 years, I felt an absolute stillness in my chest. The perpetual anxiety that had defined my existence, the constant need to anticipate their moods and deflect their criticisms, had evaporated. It was replaced by the clean, sterile efficiency of a finalized contract. My father could not tolerate the swiftness of my detachment. David built his career in regional banking by demanding loyalty and commanding rooms through sheer volume. He believed that biology granted him an irrevocable mandate to rule. When a subordinate defied him, he fired them. When a child defied him, he threatened exile. But he could not fire me, and his threat of exile had just been rendered obsolete by my own preemptive departure. He puffed up his chest, attempting to summon his old patriarchal authority. He placed his hands flat on the table and leaned his weight forward, projecting the posture of a man issuing a final warning. "You listen to me, young lady," David growled, his face flushing with returning color. "You do not get to sit here and dictate terms to the people who raised you. We provided for you. We gave you a roof and an education. You cannot just take your money and turn your back on your own blood. It is unnatural. It is a disgrace." He waited for me to shrink. He expected the booming resonance of his voice to trigger a childhood reflex of submission. He was operating on an outdated behavioral algorithm. I did not blink. I did not raise my pitch to match his volume. I met his manufactured rage with absolute bureaucratic detachment. "I am not turning my back," I replied, the words falling like blocks of ice onto the mahogany. "I am closing a door that you forgot to respect." I leaned back in my chair, creating a physical distance to mirror the emotional gulf between us. "Let us formalize the new operating parameters of this relationship," I said, treating them not as parents but as hostile liabilities. "From this moment forward, I am removing myself from the role of the family scapegoat. I will no longer attend Thanksgiving dinners or holiday gatherings where I am expected to arrive early to serve the food and stay late to wash your dishes. I will not babysit for Vanessa during her wellness brand crises. I will not subsidize a single dollar of the debts Preston has accrued through his own incompetence." My sister Vanessa, who had spent the entire lunch trying to remain invisible, finally looked up. Her eyes were wide, computing the loss of her permanent unpaid assistant. She opened her mouth to protest, but the cold finality in my expression silenced her before she could form a syllable. "If you need to contact me," I continued, speaking directly to my father, "I have established a designated email address for family correspondence. My retained counsel monitors that inbox. They will filter the communications. If an email contains a financial request, a manipulative threat, or a demand for my presence, it will be deleted without a response. In the event of a genuine medical emergency, you may send an alert to that address. Otherwise, do not expect a reply. These were not suggestions. They were fortified walls. I had spent my entire adult life watching my family trample over my privacy and my dignity. They had treated my time as a public utility available for their consumption whenever they deemed necessary. I was now shutting down the grid. I watched the realization settle over the table. This was a fate worse than a screaming match. If I had yelled at them, they could have called me hysterical. If I had cried, they could have offered fake comfort and reeled me back into their orbit. Emotion was a currency they understood how to manipulate. By stripping all feeling from my delivery and presenting them with a set of rigid logistical boundaries, I deprived them of their oxygen. Growing up, I watched my mother manage neighborhood associations and charity boards by freezing out anyone who disagreed with her agenda. She utilized silent treatment and bureaucratic red tape to punish her social rivals. It was a cold, calculating methodology designed to make the target feel powerless. I had learned her lessons well. I was simply applying her own framework to protect my sovereignty. The difference was that her boundaries were built on vanity, while mine were built on survival. "You are acting like a machine," my mother whispered, her voice hoarse and devoid of its usual melodic pitch. "You are treating your own family like a legal problem. This is not how human beings behave, Audrey. You are broken." "I am optimized," I corrected her, maintaining my steady gaze. I identified a persistent vulnerability in my operational environment. I isolated the threat and implemented a permanent patch. "You taught me that affection in this family is conditional upon compliance. I have simply chosen to opt out of the conditions." The air in the alcove was thick with the finality of my decree. I had drawn an iron boundary around my life. There was no negotiation available. There was no appeal process. The terms were set, and they were non-negotiable. My father slumped back into his chair, defeated by a logic he could not overpower. My mother stared at the table, her mind spinning as she realized she could no longer use me to absorb her toxic energy. Vanessa quietly picked up her water glass, seeking a distraction from the uncomfortable truth that her easiest resource was gone. But Preston was a different equation entirely. My parents and my sister could survive the social embarrassment of my departure. They had enough remaining assets to maintain their lifestyle even if their pride was severely damaged. Preston did not have that luxury. He was a man standing on a trapdoor that had just swung open. My brother was staring at the manila folder I had pushed toward him. The limited power of attorney sat there mocking his failure. Without my $50,000, he was going to default on his bridge loans. The investors he had defrauded with false projections were going to demand an audit. The veneer of the successful venture capitalist was going to be ripped away, exposing him to litigation and total financial ruin. He could not accept a bureaucratic dismissal. His desperation was too deep, and the consequences of his incompetence were too severe. As the silence settled over the ruined family lunch, Preston began to tremble. The tremors started in his hands and moved up his arms until his entire body was vibrating with a dangerous, volatile energy. The polite rules of the Bellevue Country Club were about to be breached, and the clinical detachment I had used to secure my freedom was about to face its ultimate test. The tremors in Preston began as a subtle vibration in his hands and rapidly escalated into a full, uncontrollable shake. For his entire life, my brother had navigated the world shielded by an impenetrable safety net woven by our parents. Whenever he failed a high school exam, our mother blamed the curriculum. Whenever he wrecked a leased vehicle, our father purchased a replacement the very next morning. Preston was conditioned to believe that consequences were for other people, for those who lacked the proper pedigree or charm. Facing a disaster that could not be talked away, bought off, or blamed on a subordinate fundamentally broke his mental architecture. He was staring into the abyss of his own ruin. The investors he had defrauded were going to demand their capital. The bridge loans were going to default. The luxury lifestyle he had curated for social media was going to collapse, exposing him to litigation and public humiliation. And the one lifeline he thought he could easily steal had just been encased in a legal fortress he could never breach. Preston snapped. He slammed his open palm against the polished mahogany table. The impact produced a sharp, concussive crack that rattled the crystal water glasses and sent a shockwave through our secluded alcove. "You are a fraud," Preston shouted, his voice shredding the enforced quiet of the Bellevue Country Club. He lunged forward, pressing his stomach against the edge of the table, his face flushing a dangerous mottled crimson. The sophisticated veneer of the venture capitalist melted away, leaving a terrified feral man thrashing against his own incompetence. "You think you can sit there and judge me?" "Preston," bellowed, the volume of his voice rising with every frantic syllable. "You owe me that money. I am your older brother. I am the pillar of this family. I built a real network while you hid in your apartment. You just got lucky with some stolen code our grandfather left behind. You are supposed to help me. That trust fund belongs to the family, and I am the one who actually needs it to build a legacy." The dining room fell into a deathly stillness. Members of the club, people who prided themselves on their pristine manners and hushed conversations, paused with their silver forks hovering in midair. The soft clinking of china and the ambient hum of polite networking vanished entirely. Every gaze in the sprawling room pivoted toward our alcove, drawn by the undeniable spectacle of a grown man throwing a tantrum over his shattered ego. My mother covered her face with both hands. A soft, strangled sob escaped her throat. Her tears flowed freely now, but they were not born of maternal sorrow or empathy for her unraveling son. Cynthia navigated Seattle society by curating an impeccable image. Her children were trophies meant to be polished, displayed, and leveraged for invitations to galas and board seats. Now her most prized trophy was screaming in the middle of a prestigious dining room, begging for money from a sister they had publicly degraded. Cynthia wept because her social currency was incinerated. The elite circles of the city were witnessing the rot beneath the Rowan family facade. She could never again sit at a charity luncheon and brag about her successful son without the other women knowing the truth. Her reputation, the only asset she truly valued, was gone. My father sat paralyzed in his chair. David had spent his entire career in regional banking, assessing risk and projecting returns. He had treated his family like a financial portfolio, heavily weighting his investments on Preston while actively attempting to short my future. Staring at his son, David finally calculated the catastrophic error of his methodology. He had backed a hollow asset and alienated the only offspring who possessed genuine concrete brilliance. He had lost his control, his pride, and his legacy in a single afternoon. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet was comprised entirely of ash. I did not flinch at Preston's outburst. I did not lean back or attempt to defend my work. I sat still, watching his meltdown with the same detached observation I used to monitor a failing algorithm. Before Preston could draw another breath to hurl another insult, Elias Thorne took a single step forward. The movement was slight, but it altered the atmospheric pressure in the alcove. True power does not need to shout to command a room. Elias did not raise his voice yet. His presence was a towering, immovable force that instantly suffocated my brother's rage. "Preston," Elias said. His tone was low, carrying the dense, unyielding weight of a collapsing star. "If you raise your voice to my partner again," Elias stated, his dark eyes locking onto my brother with a chilling, predatory focus, "I will personally ensure your name is blacklisted from every venture capital firm, from Seattle to Silicon Valley. You will never secure another meeting, another term sheet, or another dollar in this industry. Do you understand me?" The word partner hung in the crisp air of the dining room. Elias had not referred to me as his employee, his acquisition target, or his friend. He had elevated my status to his equal in front of the people who had spent my entire life trying to keep me beneath them. Preston deflated, the frantic, aggressive energy drained from his body as if a plug had been pulled. His shoulders slumped and he sank back into his chair, utterly broken. He realized the threat was not an empty boast. Elias possessed the network and the influence to erase Preston from the tech ecosystem with a single phone call. My brother closed his eyes, surrendering to the void of his own failure. The confrontation was over. The variables had been resolved. There was nothing left for me to analyze or optimize in this environment. I reached into my leather purse one final time. I bypassed the secured portfolio containing my signed contracts and retrieved my wallet. I opened the fold and extracted a crisp $50 bill. The green paper felt rigid and smooth between my fingertips. I placed the bill on the mahogany table. Using my index finger, I slid the currency until the top edge aligned perfectly with the base of my crystal water glass. I smoothed the paper flat, ensuring the geometry was precise, clean, and exact. It was enough to cover the cost of my iced tea and the untouched salad resting on my plate. It was a final, undeniable act of financial independence. I was leaving them with a clean ledger. I owed them nothing, not a single dollar, not a drop of loyalty, and not even the tab for a lunch I had never wanted to attend. I picked up my purse and stood from the table. I did not look at my mother, who was still hiding her face in her hands. I did not look at my father, who was staring vacantly at the half-empty glasses. I did not look at Vanessa, who was shrinking into the upholstery as if trying to merge with the furniture. I turned my attention to the man standing at the edge of the alcove. "Thank you for your time, Elias," I said, my voice carrying clear and steady through the quiet room. "I will see you on Monday morning." "I look forward to it, Audrey," Elias replied, stepping aside to clear my path. I turned and walked out of the alcove. I navigated the long carpeted expanse of the Bellevue Country Club dining room. My posture was straight, my pace measured and unhurried. I felt the gaze of every patron tracking my departure, but their judgment no longer held any weight. I was a sovereign entity operating entirely outside their jurisdiction. I pushed through the heavy glass doors at the front entrance and stepped out into the cool, damp air of the Pacific Northwest. The scent of pine and rain washed over me, cleansing the stale pretense of the country club from my lungs. Behind me, the silence I left at the mahogany table was absolute, a permanent void where my compliance used to be. Seattle operates like a dense neural network. Information does not travel in a straight line. It propagates outward, touching every connected node within seconds. The Bellevue Country Club possessed the highest concentration of connected nodes in the state. By the time I navigated my practical sedan back across the floating bridge to my apartment, the data regarding my family was already transmitting across the city. The immediate consequences of my revelation rippled through the social and financial standing of the Rowan family with swift and clinical precision. Elias Thorne did not need to make a single phone call to destroy my brother. His public defense of me in that dining room alcove was more than enough. In the local tech industry, proximity to Elias is the ultimate currency. A public rebuke from him is a permanent death sentence. By Tuesday morning, rumors of Preston insulting the new partner of the most powerful holding company in the region had saturated the venture capital ecosystem. The investors currently funding his lifestyle optimization platform demanded an immediate audit of his books. When Preston failed to produce the underlying code and could not explain the staggering burn rate, the remaining capital vanished. The bridge loans defaulted before the end of the week. The cascading failure of his business was mathematical and inevitable. His leased luxury sedan was repossessed from the parking garage of his downtown office building. The property management company evicted him from his upscale apartment. Before the end of the month, my brother was forced to declare formal bankruptcy. The golden child, the supposed visionary who was meant to carry the family legacy, packed his bespoke suits into cardboard boxes and moved back into his childhood bedroom on Mercer Island. He was stripped of the illusions he had purchased with my grandfather's memory. He was reduced to nothing. The collapse of one node inevitably places immense strain on adjacent connections. Vanessa had spent her entire life hovering safely above the fray. She utilized our parents' financial safety net while maintaining a pristine digital aesthetic for her wellness brand. Her business model relied on selling overpriced serums and woven baskets to an audience that believed she embodied effortless wealth. But with Preston bankrupt and our parents frantically attempting to cover his mounting legal fees, her hidden safety net dissolved overnight. On a Thursday afternoon, my phone registered a missed call. I did not answer. A transcription of a voicemail appeared in my designated family inbox. I read the text while sipping black coffee in my quiet kitchen. Vanessa sounded breathless. Her usual curated calm was replaced by a shrill, frantic panic. She demanded to know why angry investors from Preston's ruined startup were suddenly calling her personal cell phone. They were harassing her, assuming she was hiding his assets within her wellness brand. Then the true purpose of her call emerged. She begged me for a temporary injection of capital. She framed the request as a short-term loan to help her secure a new manufacturing contract. She promised to pay me back with interest, claiming that we were sisters and needed to support each other during turbulent times. I did not delete the message. I forwarded the audio file directly to my retained counsel. I instructed them to handle the inquiry using our established protocol. 24 hours later, Vanessa received a certified letter drafted by a senior partner at my law firm. The document contained no familial warmth. It was a sterile boilerplate rejection. The letter stated that my financial assets were bound by strict fiduciary guidelines and were unavailable for private loans. It formally requested that she cease all unauthorized communication regarding financial matters. Vanessa had ignored my struggles for 29 years. Now she was experiencing the cold, bureaucratic wall I had erected to protect my peace. The access she had always taken for granted was permanently revoked. The most predictable reaction came from my mother. Cynthia Rowan viewed reality as a rough draft, something she could continually edit until it favored her desired narrative. 2 weeks after the country club incident, she attended her regular Wednesday gathering at the local bridge club. The women in that room were the primary gatekeepers of local high society. My mother arrived wearing a new silk blouse, projecting a radiant, unbothered confidence. When the topic of my recent acquisition inevitably surfaced among the card tables, Cynthia leaned forward and attempted to claim the victory. She told her peers that she had always recognized my hidden genius. She spun a fabricated tale about how she and David had intentionally pushed me to develop independence. She claimed my success was the direct result of her excellent parenting and their tough love approach. But data cannot be spun when the raw files have already been distributed. The women at the card table did not smile and offer their congratulations. They exchanged loaded, silent glances. One of the women, a prominent local philanthropist who had been dining 2 tables away during our confrontation, gently placed her cards face down on the velvet felt. The philanthropist looked at my mother and politely inquired about the manila folder and the $50 bill I had left on the table. She did not raise her voice. She simply presented the contradictory facts for everyone to hear. My mother froze. The delicate teacup in her hand rattled against its matching saucer. The carefully constructed facade crumbled, leaving her exposed to the quiet, devastating judgment of her peers. She realized in that agonizing moment that the rumor mill had already processed the truth. They knew she had attempted to extort her youngest daughter. They knew Preston was a fraud. They knew her entire social identity was built on a foundation of predatory lies. Cynthia excused herself from the bridge club before the second round of games even began. She walked to her car in burning humiliation, forever exiled from the circles she had spent 3 decades trying to penetrate. The social currency she valued above her own children was gone, leaving her isolated in a large house with a bankrupt son and a fractured legacy. I observed these cascading events from a distance. I did not feel a sense of triumphant glee. There was no petty joy in watching the people who raised me descend into a prison of their own design. Instead, I felt a quiet, validating exhaustion. It was the specific fatigue that follows the successful conclusion of a grueling, high-stakes experiment. I charted the fallout the way I charted data for my predictive models. The results were not random. They were the inevitable outcomes of deeply flawed inputs. My family had inputted arrogance, manipulation, and profound disrespect into the system for decades. They had built an ecosystem that relied on false variables and suppressed the actual metrics of reality. The system was always going to crash. I simply removed myself from the blast radius before the structural failure occurred. My absence was the catalyst that exposed the rot. By refusing to absorb their debts and their shame, I forced them to carry the weight of their own actions, and the weight broke them. The noise of their collapse gradually faded into the background of my new life. The frantic voicemails ceased entirely. The desperate attempts at manipulation stopped as they realized my legal fortress was impenetrable. I had successfully severed the toxic roots that tied me to their illusions. The space I had cleared now required careful cultivation. The acquisition of Project Evergreen was complete, the capital was secured in my blind trust, and my position alongside Elias Thorne was solidified. I was no longer the invisible footstool of the Rowan family. I was a sovereign entity, and it was time to establish a new operational baseline in an environment that actually respected my worth. 6 months have passed since the afternoon I left the $50 bill on the mahogany table of the Bellevue Country Club. The turning of the seasons brought a deep, steady winter to the Pacific Northwest. I am sitting on the wooden deck of my new home. It is a modest cabin nestled high in the Cascade Mountains. I did not purchase a sprawling estate or a flashy imported sports car. Those are the trappings of people who desperately need the external world to validate their internal existence. I bought silence. I bought the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I bought a view consisting entirely of Douglas firs and cedar trees stretching out toward a limitless horizon. The air up here is crisp and clean. I hold a heavy ceramic mug filled with dark roast coffee, letting the steam rise and warm my face against the morning chill. I am wearing a thick, comfortable fleece pullover and worn denim jeans. There are no velvet ropes in the mountains. There are no strict dress codes or judgmental maitre d's waiting to assess my lineage. There is only the wind moving through the evergreen canopy. It provides a constant soothing rhythm that clears my mind of any lingering static left behind by my former life. My professional reality now reflects the exact geometry of my personal peace. The acquisition of Project Evergreen closed smoothly, and the resulting capital is securely insulated within my blind trust. But I did not take the money and vanish into early retirement. That would have meant abandoning the architecture I spent years building in the shadows. Instead, I transitioned into a role as a lead structural architect for Elias Thorne at his primary holding company. My days are no longer defined by fetching drinks for an arrogant brother or absorbing passive-aggressive insults from a status-obsessed mother. I spend my hours in a sunlit minimalist office in downtown Seattle, surrounded by people who speak my language. We do not discuss country club memberships or the designer labels stitched into our clothing. We discuss predictive modeling, routing efficiencies, and server load optimization. We solve complex data problems that impact global supply chains. When I speak in a boardroom, the room goes quiet. My colleagues listen because my input has proven tangible, measurable value. I am surrounded by genuine peers who respect my mind. Elias treats me not just as a colleague, but as a trusted visionary. The contrast between this environment and the toxic wasteland of my family dynamic is profound. In this new space, my competence is the only currency that matters. In data science, we utilize a concept called data cleansing. It is the process of detecting and removing corrupt or inaccurate records from a centralized database. For nearly 3 decades, I allowed corrupted data to dictate my self-worth. I accepted the false inputs provided by my parents as objective reality. I internalized my mother's subtle insults, my father's dismissive waves, and my brother's arrogant demands. The act of walking out of that dining room was the ultimate data cleanse. I purged the inaccurate records. I isolated the hostile nodes and deleted their access to my system. The resulting clarity is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced the suffocating weight of lifelong manipulation. The holiday season arrived and departed during my first few months in the cabin. In years past, November and December were grueling endurance tests. I would spend those months organizing menus, cleaning guest rooms, and purchasing gifts for a sister and a brother who never bothered to learn my favorite color. This year, I stayed in the mountains. I lit a fire in the stone hearth, cooked a simple meal for myself, and read a book about nautical engineering. It was the most fulfilling holiday I have ever experienced. My family did not handle my permanent absence with grace. They attempted to reach out utilizing the designated email address my legal counsel monitors. The filtering system worked flawlessly. I received a monthly summary report from my attorneys detailing the inbound communications. Cynthia sent a thinly veiled message the week before Thanksgiving. She suggested that the holidays were a time for forgiveness, and stated that they were willing to overlook my past transgressions if I attended dinner. It was a classic deployment of manipulative reversal, attempting to frame my financial independence as a mistake they could graciously pardon. Vanessa sent a brief note containing a photograph of her children, weaponizing my niece and nephew to elicit an emotional response. Preston did not write at all. He was presumably too consumed by his bankruptcy proceedings and the loss of his luxury lifestyle to formulate an email. I did not read the original messages. I read the sterile summaries provided by my lawyers, and then I instructed them to archive the communications without a response. There was no cinematic reconciliation. There were no tearful apologies or sudden revelations of parental growth. People who build their entire identities on illusions do not change when the illusions are shattered. They simply search for new victims to sustain their false reality. I had removed myself from their supply chain, and I had no intention of ever restoring the connection. Sitting on my deck taking another sip of my coffee, I reflect on the true nature of toxic families. They are not merely difficult or demanding. They function like invasive algorithms, rewriting your internal code to serve their specific purposes. They require you to shrink so they can feel large. They demand that you accept the role of the scapegoat because without a designated failure, they are forced to confront their own profound mediocrity. My mother needed me to be invisible so she could shine. Preston needed me to be subservient so he could feel powerful. They did not hate me. They hated the possibility that I might outgrow the tiny suffocating box they had constructed for me. I never sought revenge against David, Cynthia, Vanessa, or Preston. Revenge requires an ongoing emotional investment in the people who hurt you. It tethers you to their drama and keeps you locked in their orbit. I chose a different path. I focused entirely on building a life so solid, so grounded in concrete facts and undeniable achievements that their lies could no longer survive in its presence. I defeated their fiction by introducing undeniable reality. The trust fund they tried to steal remains safely in my accounts, though it is now a mere fraction of my overall net worth. The country club where they tried to orchestrate my surrender is a place I will never visit again. I have traded the mahogany tables and the crystal chandeliers for raw timber and natural light. I have traded the frantic, desperate pursuit of status for the quiet, enduring power of genuine capability. The morning sun breaks through the mist rolling off the Cascade Peaks. The light catches the dark green needles of the Douglas firs, turning the forest into a vibrant, living tapestry. I set my empty ceramic mug down on the wooden railing of the deck. I lean forward, resting my hands on the smooth timber, and look out over the vast expanse of the evergreen canopy. For 29 years, I waited for my family to see me. I performed my assigned duties, kept my head down, and hoped that one day they would recognize my worth. I now understand that waiting for validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you is a terminal endeavor. You cannot force someone to see the truth when their survival depends on believing a lie. I stopped waiting. I stopped shrinking. I stood up in a crowded room, presented the receipts of their exploitation, and walked away. In doing so, I allowed myself to be seen by the rest of the world. I am no longer the invisible footstool of the Rowan family. I am a low-profile genius living in the mountains, writing code that changes industries, and breathing air that belongs entirely to me. It is a quiet existence, but it is built on a foundation of unassailable facts. This life is my testament to the power of silence, the lethal precision of truth, and the profound courage it takes to finally close the door.
We spend our lives building homes, filling them with carefully curated photographs, polishing the surfaces, and hoping the world looks through our windows and sees absolute perfection. In American culture, we are often taught from a very young age that success is a visible, tangible entity. It is a corner office in a glass building. It is a luxury vehicle parked in a paved driveway. It is a child whose achievements we can wear like a badge of honor at a Sunday dinner or a country club gathering. We chase the American dream, but in the process, we sometimes lose the very souls we are trying to provide for. When we look at Audrey's story, we see the devastating consequence of confusing a polished surface with a solid foundation. Her journey is not just a dramatic family conflict. It is a profound, unflinching mirror held up to modern society, asking us a terrifying and necessary question. When we look at our children, do we see them as independent, breathing souls with their own destinies, or do we see them as extensions of our own fragile egos? The tragedy of David and Cynthia Rowan is fundamentally a tragedy of spiritual blindness. It is an ignorance that infects so many traditional family structures when parents lose sight of their core responsibilities. They traded genuine human connection for the hollow illusion of status. In their relentless pursuit of prestige, they committed the ultimate parental betrayal by turning their children into tools for their own validation. Preston and Vanessa, who offered loud, empty prestige, were elevated to the status of golden children. Audrey, whose brilliance was quiet, disciplined, and unassuming, was reduced to a scapegoat. She was treated as a living footstool meant only to absorb their failures and elevate her siblings. This is the inherent danger of conditional love. It is not actually love at all, but a transaction. The moment Audrey revealed her massive financial success, her mother's attitude completely reversed. That was not a mother finally seeing her child for who she was. That was greed and delusion disguised as affection. As parents, we must look inward and ask ourselves the hardest question of all. Are we raising our children to be good, fulfilled people, or are we simply raising them to make us look good to strangers? To raise a child with true emotional awareness requires us to cultivate our own inner morality first. The ethics of parenting begin with removing our selfish expectations. Every child is born with a unique mission, a distinct rhythm of development, and their own specific strengths. We cannot take the narrow, hyper-competitive definition of success handed to us by society and force it onto the shoulders of our children. The act of assigning labels like the favorite and the failure is an emotional crime that leaves scars lasting a lifetime. Morality in parenting demands fairness, boundless compassion, and the willingness to nurture a child's spirit through respect rather than emotional exploitation. If a family is to be a sanctuary, it must be a place where a child is loved simply for existing, not for what they can produce or provide to the family brand. Beyond morality, guiding a child requires profound wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to see past the noise of the crowd and pierce through the glittering facade of societal expectations. A truly wise parent would have recognized the empty, deceitful nature of Preston's flashy pitches long before they led to ruin. That same parent would have appreciated the deep, disciplined focus of Audrey's quiet work in the shadows. But wisdom requires honesty, and honesty is often deeply uncomfortable. It forces us to admit that a simple, sincere meal shared at a mismatched kitchen table holds infinitely more value than 1,000 fake compliments delivered at a prestigious banquet. We must teach our children to value substance over style, and we can only do that by modeling that behavior ourselves over the long term. Building a healthy family dynamic also requires immense courage and resilience. This is not the courage to fight the outside world, but the courage to confront the darkness within ourselves. When Audrey presented the undeniable facts of their exploitation, her parents lacked the strength to look inward. Even when their toxicity was exposed to the light of day, they tried to manipulate the narrative, play the victim, and deflect the blame. It takes a monumental level of personal strength for a parent to look at their child, drop their authority, and say, "I was wrong, and I am deeply sorry." Instead, they pushed and pushed until Audrey had no choice but to build an iron wall around her life. Respecting boundaries is a fundamental expression of love. As our children grow into adults, our role must gracefully shift from managers to guides. We have to possess the resilience to step back, give them the space to be independent, and accept the boundaries they set. If we cannot control our own egos, we risk losing our children entirely. Audrey's story is a wake-up call reminding us that we must stop building castles on sand. We must stop chasing the applause of strangers and start tending to the quiet, vital relationships within our own homes. If you found a piece of yourself in this reflection, if you have ever had to build your own boundaries, walk away from a toxic environment, or navigate the complex waters of family expectations, please subscribe to the channel Orange Vengeance. We share stories that help quiet voices find their strength and remind you that you are never alone in your journey toward peace. Think about Audrey sitting on the wooden deck of her cabin in the Evergreen forest. Her peace is not loud. It does not require an audience or a stage. It simply exists rooted firmly in truth. When we finally strip away the titles, the wealth, and the heavy expectations of who we are supposed to be, we are left with the raw reality of how we treat the people closest to us. We spend so much time worrying about the legacy we will leave behind for the world to see. But perhaps true legacy is not what we display to the public. Perhaps it is the quiet moments in the kitchen, the words we choose when no one else is listening, and the haunting realization that the doors we lock to protect our own pride might be the very same doors that keep us forever trapped outside, looking in at a warmth we can no longer touch.